Sometimes the choices we make to save ourselves end up destroying us in ways we never imagined. Sometimes running from love only brings us face to face with it when we're least prepared to fight. In New Mexico territory, a broken chapel shelters Sister Mercy Langford, a young nun with trembling hands and buried secrets. She came seeking peace, but peace is hard to find in a land where outlaws rule and salvation feels like a distant memory. Then Weston Hart walks through her chapel doors. He's a giant of a cowboy who doesn't ask for what he wants, he takes it. And what he wants is her. He saved her life once. Now he's come to collect what he believes is his. What happens when a woman sworn to God meets a man who claims she belongs to him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cracked windows of the chapel of San Rafael, painting the adobe walls in shades of amber and dust. Sister Mercy Langford knelt before the makeshift altar, her rosary beads worn smooth between her fingers, the same beads that had comforted her through countless sleepless nights since arriving in this God-forsaken corner of New Mexico territory 3 months ago. The chapel bore the scars of a fire that had swept through 2 years prior, leaving the bell tower half-melted and the wooden pews charred to blackened skeletons. But Mercy had found something beautiful in its brokenness, something that spoke to her own fractured soul. Here, in this place where even God seemed to struggle against the harsh desert wind, she could hide from the world that had taken everything from her. Her morning prayers came in whispers, words that had once brought comfort, now feeling hollow against the vastness of the high desert. The territory stretched endlessly beyond the chapel's cracked walls, mesas that glowed like burnished copper in the dawn light, arroyos carved deep by flash floods, and time. And everywhere, the persistent wind that carried the scent of sage and something wilder, something that reminded her of freedom she'd never known. Sister Mercy. The voice belonged to Father Miguel, an elderly priest whose weathered hands and kind eyes spoke of a lifetime spent ministering to the forgotten souls of the frontier. He'd been her only companion since arriving from Santa Fe, the only one who knew fragments of her story, though not all of it. Never all of it. "Good morning, Father." She rose from her knees with practiced grace, brushing dust from her worn habit. The fabric had once been pristine black, but months in the desert had faded it to a color somewhere between charcoal and ash. "The Martinez family has asked for last rites for the grandfather. Will you assist me?" Mercy nodded, grateful for any task that might keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering down dangerous paths. In her previous life, the life before the convent, before the vows, before everything changed, she had been Elizabeth Catherine Morrison, daughter of a prosperous merchant in St. Louis. She'd worn silk dresses and attended cotillions, dreamed of love and marriage, and children who would carry on a family name. But Elizabeth Catherine Morrison had died the same night her husband did, in a pool of blood on a saloon floor in Dodge City. Only Sister Mercy remained now, picking up the pieces of a shattered life and trying to build something holy from the wreckage. The walk to the Martinez homestead took them through the heart of Espiranza, Spanish for hope, though hope seemed in short supply in this dusty collection of adobe buildings and weathered timber. The town existed primarily to serve the cattle ranches that sprawled across the territory, and the men who worked those ranches were hard men who lived hard lives. They treated the chapel with respectful distance, tipping their hats to Father Miguel and averting their eyes from Sister Mercy in the way men do when faced with something they can't quite understand. All except one. Even now, as they walked the rutted main street, Mercy could feel eyes on her. She didn't need to look to know that Weston Hart was watching from the porch of Sullivan's saloon, where he conducted much of his business. She'd learned to recognize his presence, the way animals sense approaching storms, a change in the air that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch. Weston Hart owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, commanded respect from men twice his age, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd never backed down from a fight. At 32, he was tall enough to block out the sun and broad enough across the shoulders to make even the biggest cowboys look small beside him. His dark hair was always slightly tousled from the wind, and his eyes, Lord help her, his eyes were the color of whiskey and just as intoxicating. But it wasn't his size or his reputation that made Mercy's hands tremble when he was near. It was the way he looked at her, as if she were a puzzle he intended to solve, a challenge he meant to conquer. It was the way he spoke to her, never with the careful deference other men showed to women of the cloth, but with a directness that made her remember she had once been a woman first and a nun second. The Martinez adobe sat at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open range and the mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the endless sky. Inside, the family had gathered around an old man whose breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps. His granddaughter Maria met them at the door with red-rimmed eyes and hands that shook as she led them inside. "He's been asking for the last rites since dawn," she whispered. "He says he can hear his wife calling to him." Father Miguel moved to the bedside with the grace of long practice, his voice gentle as he administered the final sacrament. Mercy held Maria's hand and murmured words of comfort, but part of her mind wandered to thoughts she shouldn't entertain. Thoughts of what it might be like to have someone love her so completely that death itself couldn't silence the call between them. When the old man passed peacefully, with his family surrounding him, Mercy helped prepare the body, while Father Miguel spoke with the relatives about funeral arrangements. It was necessary work, sacred work, but it always left her feeling hollow. Death was the one certainty in this harsh land, coming for saints and sinners alike with equal measure. They walked back to town in comfortable silence, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. The chapel provided blessed coolness, its thick adobe walls keeping out the worst of the heat. Mercy was arranging flowers on the altar when she heard boots on the wooden steps outside. Heavy boots, deliberate steps. Her heart began to race before she even turned around because she knew those footsteps, had memorized the sound of them over the past 3 months, the way a sailor learns to read the patterns of waves. Weston Hart filled the doorway like a force of nature. Today, he wore a white shirt open at the collar, revealing a V of tanned skin dusted with dark hair. His leather vest hung loose, and his gun belt sat low on his hips with the easy familiarity of a man who'd been armed since childhood. He removed his hat as he entered, running long fingers through his hair in a gesture that made something flutter deep in Mercy's chest. "Sister Mercy." His voice was like aged bourbon, smooth and warm, with just enough bite to make you remember you were drinking something dangerous. "Mr. Hart." She kept her voice steady through sheer force of will. "How may I help you?" He moved closer, his spurs chiming softly against the stone floor. "I hear old Martinez passed on today. Good man. Worked for my father before he started his own spread. He died peacefully, surrounded by family. That's all any of us can ask for, I suppose." Weston's eyes never left her face. "But that's not why I'm here." Mercy's fingers tightened around the stem of a wildflower she'd been arranging. "Oh? There's been talk in town, men riding through, asking questions about the chapel, about you." A chill ran down her spine despite the afternoon heat. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make me think your past might be catching up with you, darling." The endearment sent heat spiraling through her, followed immediately by a wave of guilt so strong it nearly buckled her knees. She was a bride of Christ, sworn to celibacy and devotion, yet this man's voice could make her forget every vow she'd ever taken. "I don't know what you mean." Weston stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and sage that clung to his skin, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "I think you do. I think you've been running from something since the day you arrived here, and I think whatever it is just caught your scent." Mercy forced herself to meet his gaze, even though doing so felt like staring into the sun. My past is my own concern, Mr. Hart. Not when it threatens to bring danger to this town. Not when it threatens to bring danger to you. The concern in his voice undid something inside her chest, loosened a knot she'd carried for months. He cared about her safety, genuinely cared, and that knowledge was more dangerous than any threat from her past. I can take care of myself. Can you? He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched a strand of dark hair that had escaped her wimple. Because you look like a woman who's been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, and I'm thinking maybe it's time someone helped you set it down. His fingers were calloused from years of ranch work, rough against the softness of her skin, and she should have stepped back, should have reminded him of who she was, what she represented. Instead, she found herself leaning into his touch like a flower, turning towards sunlight. Weston. His name escaped her lips like a prayer, or perhaps a confession. That's the first time you've said my name. His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. I've been waiting 3 months to hear you say it. This is wrong. But she didn't pull away. Wrong according to who? That worn-out book of rules you've been hiding behind. His hand cupped her face, thumb brushing across her lower lip. Or wrong because it feels too right. Before she could answer, before she could think of an answer that wouldn't damn them both, the chapel door creaked open. Father Miguel stood silhouetted against the afternoon light, taking in the scene with eyes that had witnessed too many human failings to show surprise. Weston dropped his hand and stepped back, but not before whispering so low that only she could hear, "This isn't finished between us, sister. Not by a long shot." He touched the brim of his hat to Father Miguel and strode out of the chapel, leaving Mercy standing among the wildflowers, with her heart racing and her faith shaken to its very foundations. Father Miguel approached slowly, his expression kind but troubled. "Child, there are paths that lead to salvation and paths that lead to ruin. Sometimes they look remarkably similar at the start." Mercy sank onto one of the few remaining pews, her legs suddenly unsteady. "I know, Father, I know." But even as she spoke the words, even as she tried to summon the proper contrition, part of her was already thinking about tomorrow, wondering if Weston would come again, hoping he would. And that hope, she knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. Outside, the wind picked up as evening approached, carrying with it the promise of change. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, a wild sound that seemed to echo the restlessness in Mercy's heart. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but all she could think about was the feeling of Weston's thumb against her lip and the way he'd said her name like it was something precious. The burnt chapel bell caught the last rays of sunlight, its melted bronze gleaming like a promise of redemption, or perhaps a warning of the fire that comes when desire meets duty on the harsh frontier of the human heart. The attack came on a Tuesday evening when the desert air had finally begun to cool and the first stars were emerging in the vast expanse of darkening sky. Mercy was alone in the chapel, as had become her custom since Father Miguel's arthritis had worsened, making the evening walk from town increasingly difficult for the elderly priest. She was lighting the last of the votive candles when she heard the horses, too many horses moving too fast for honest travelers. The sound made her stomach clench with a fear she thought she'd left behind in her previous life. In the territories, nothing good ever came at a gallop after sunset. Through the cracked window, she could see 4 riders approaching the chapel, their faces hidden beneath the brims of weather-beaten hats. They rode with the loose, predatory grace of men accustomed to taking what they wanted, and the way they spread out as they approached told her they'd done this before. Mercy's hand instinctively went to the wooden cross at her throat, but she forced herself to remain calm. Perhaps they were simply travelers seeking shelter for the night, or wounded men in need of sanctuary. The church had always been a place of refuge, even in this lawless corner of the world. The leader dismounted first, a thin man with a scraggly beard and eyes that reflected the lamplight like a coyote's. His companions followed suit, their spurs jangling against the stone steps as they approached the chapel door. One of them, A heavy-set man with arms like tree trunks carried a shotgun with casual familiarity. "Good evening, sister." The leader's voice carried a mock politeness that made Mercy's skin crawl. "Mighty fine evening for a prayer meeting, wouldn't you say?" "The chapel is always open to those seeking God's comfort," Mercy replied, though her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "How may I help you?" The man laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Oh, we're not here for comfort, sister. We're here about that collection plate of yours. Word is, you've been gathering donations from the good folks of Espiranza. Any donations go directly to caring for the poor and maintaining the chapel," Mercy said carefully. She kept her hands visible, moving slowly as she'd learned during her darker days. "I'm afraid there's very little money here." "See, now that's where I think you're being modest." The leader stepped inside the chapel, his boots echoing in the sacred space. "A pretty little nun, all alone out here, asking the community for support. I bet you've collected quite a nest egg by now." Behind him, his companions spread out, effectively blocking any escape route. The man with the shotgun positioned himself near the altar, while the other two flanked the sides of the chapel. They moved with practiced efficiency, and Mercy realized with growing dread that this was no random robbery. "There's no money here," she repeated, taking a small step backward. "You're welcome to look for yourselves." "Oh, we intend to." The leader's smile revealed teeth stained brown with tobacco. "But first, maybe you could tell us about your previous line of work. Before you found religion, that is." Mercy's blood turned to ice. They knew. Somehow, these men knew who she really was, what she'd been before taking her vows. The careful fiction she'd built around Sister Mercy Langford was crumbling, and beneath it lay Elizabeth Morrison, a woman with a past that men like these could use against her. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do, darling. Elizabeth Catherine Morrison, married to Johnny Morrison, one of the most wanted men in 3 territories, before someone put a bullet in his brain." The leader pulled out a crumpled wanted poster, old, but unmistakably bearing her face beneath the name Elizabeth Morrison. "Funny thing about being married to an outlaw. Makes folks wonder what the little wife might have known about his activities." Mercy's hand tightened on the cross at her throat. Johnny Morrison had been her husband for exactly 6 months before his past caught up with him. 6 months of living in fear, of discovering that the charming man she'd married was capable of unspeakable violence. She'd been planning to leave him when the law finally found him in that Dodge City saloon. "My husband is dead," she said quietly. "Whatever sins he committed died with him." "See, that's where you're wrong, sister." The heavy-set man with the shotgun spoke for the first time, his voice like gravel in a coffee grinder. "Johnny Morrison robbed 3 banks and a railroad payroll before he died. Money that was never recovered. Money that his widow might know something about. I know nothing about any stolen money." "Maybe not, but there's folks who'd pay handsomely to ask you about it, personal-like. Folks who knew Johnny real well." The leader stepped closer, close enough that Mercy could smell the whiskey on his breath. "We figure a woman who can convince a whole town she's a holy sister is probably clever enough to hide a fortune." Fear and anger warred in Mercy's chest. She'd come to this place seeking redemption, trying to build something good from the ashes of her destroyed life. Now these men wanted to drag her back into the violence she'd spent 3 years trying to escape. "Take whatever you want from the chapel," she said, backing toward the altar. "But I can't tell you about money that doesn't exist." "Oh, we're taking more than what's in the collection plate, sister." The leader's hand moved to the knife at his belt. "We're taking you." That's when the first gunshot rang out. The bullet splintered the doorframe inches from the leader's head, sending wood chips flying across the chapel floor. All 5 people inside froze for a heartbeat before chaos erupted. "Nobody moves." Weston Hart's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He stood in the chapel doorway, his Colt .45 drawn and steady in his hand. In the lamplight, he looked like some avenging angel, tall, imposing, and absolutely furious. "Hands where I can see them, or the next shot won't be a warning." The heavy-set man started to raise his shotgun, but Weston's gun swung toward him with deadly precision. "I wouldn't, friend. Not unless you want to meet your maker tonight." "This ain't your business, Hart," the leader snarled, though his hands remained visible. "This is between us and the sister here. Funny thing about that." Weston stepped into the chapel, his weapon never wavering. "Anything that happens in my territory becomes my business real quick, especially when it involves threatening women under the protection of the church." "Your territory?" The leader laughed, but there was less confidence in it now. "Last I checked, you were just a rancher. Rancher who employs half the men in 3 counties. Rancher who has friends in the territorial marshal's office. Rancher who's fast enough with a gun to put all 4 of you in the ground before you clear leather." Weston's voice was calm, conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Now I'm going to ask you once to mount up and ride out. After that, we do this the hard way." The 4 men exchanged glances, weighing their options. They were outnumbered in terms of firepower, but Weston was alone, and they had good positions inside the chapel. The decision was made for them when the man near the altar decided to take his chances with the shotgun. The chapel erupted in gunfire and chaos. Weston dove left as the shotgun boomed, buckshot shredding the pew where he'd been standing. His return shot took the heavy-set man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the stone floor. Mercy dropped behind the altar as bullets flew overhead, her hands pressed to her ears against the deafening noise. Wood splintered and plaster dust rained down as the bandits sought cover behind the remaining pews. Weston moved like a man born to violence, rolling from cover to cover, his gun barking with deadly accuracy. One of the flanking bandits cried out and clutched his leg, blood seeping between his fingers. The leader and his remaining companion returned fire desperately, but they were outmatched by a man who'd been handling firearms since childhood. "Mercy!" Weston's voice cut through the gunfire. "Stay down!" The sound of her name, her real name, not her religious title, sent a shock through her system. In the middle of a gunfight, with death flying through the air around them, Weston Hart was thinking of her as a woman, not as a nun. The realization should have horrified her. Instead, it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the chapel's stuffy air. The leader made a desperate rush toward the altar, perhaps thinking he could use Mercy as a human shield. He never made it halfway. Weston's shot took him center mass, the impact lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing into the baptismal font. Sudden silence fell over the chapel, broken only by the groans of wounded men and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Weston rose from behind an overturned pew, his weapon still trained on the survivors. "Anyone else feeling lucky tonight?" he asked mildly. The 2 remaining bandits, one wounded, one scared, raised their hands in surrender. Blood from the heavy-set man's shoulder wound was spreading across the chapel floor, staining the stone with crimson evidence of the night's violence. Weston kept his gun on them while moving to check on Mercy. She was crouched behind the altar, unharmed but shaking, her dark eyes wide with shock, and something else, something that looked almost like gratitude mixed with desire. "You hurt?" he asked, extending his hand to help her up. "No." She let him pull her to her feet, noting how warm and solid his hand felt in hers. "No, I'm fine, but they knew who I really am." Weston's jaw tightened as he took in the wanted poster that had fallen to the floor during the gunfight. Elizabeth Morrison's young face stared up at them from the crumpled paper, a reminder of the life she'd tried so hard to leave behind. "We'll deal with that later," he said, his voice gentle now that the immediate danger had passed. "Right now, we need to get the sheriff out here." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses filled the night air. Sheriff Coleman arrived with 2 deputies, taking charge of the wounded bandits and the body of their leader. But even as order was restored to the chapel, Mercy couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. Weston had saved her life, fought for her, killed for her, and in doing so, he'd claimed something she wasn't sure she was ready to give, but equally sure she was no longer strong enough to deny. As the sheriff's men loaded the prisoners onto horses for the ride back to town, Weston pulled out a blood-stained handkerchief and handed it to Mercy. The white cotton was marked with crimson from where he'd wiped a cut on his cheek, a tangible reminder of the violence he'd faced to protect her. "Keep this," he said quietly, his eyes holding hers in the lamplight. "So, you remember that there are some things worth fighting for." Mercy took the handkerchief with trembling fingers, knowing she would treasure it for the rest of her life. It represented everything she couldn't have and everything she desperately wanted: protection, sacrifice, and love from a man who would face down hell itself to keep her safe. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you come?" Weston's hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "Because you belong to me now, darling, and I protect what's mine." The declaration should have outraged her, should have sent her scrambling back behind the safety of her religious vows. Instead, it filled her with a fierce joy that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She was no longer just Sister Mercy, servant of God. She was a woman, Elizabeth, Mercy, or whoever she chose to be, and she belonged to Weston Hart. In the 3 days following the attack, Weston Hart became a fixture at the chapel of San Rafael. He arrived each morning with the sunrise, ostensibly to check on repairs to the gunshot damage, but Mercy knew better. She could feel his eyes on her as she went about her daily tasks, sense his presence even when he was supposedly examining the splintered pews or discussing security measures with Father Miguel. His leather journal rarely left his side, a worn brown book that he'd pull out to sketch or write when he thought no one was watching. Mercy had caught glimpses of the pages when he left it open on the altar, rough drawings of the chapel's architecture, notes about defensive positions, and what looked suspiciously like sketches of her profile as she knelt in prayer. "He's quite taken with you," Father Miguel observed on the third morning, watching through the window as Weston supervised the installation of new locks on the chapel doors. "I've never seen a man so determined to protect something that isn't his." Mercy's hands stilled on the altar cloth she was mending. "I'm not his to protect." "Are you so certain?" The old priest's voice carried no judgment, only gentle inquiry. "Sometimes God places people in our path for reasons we don't immediately understand. And sometimes the devil does the same thing," Father Miguel chuckled, a sound like rustling leaves. "In my experience, child, the heart rarely confuses the two. It's the mind that creates complications." Outside, Weston's voice carried through the morning air as he directed the workers. He'd hired men from his own ranch to repair the damage, refusing to let the church bear the cost. When Mercy had protested, he'd simply looked at her with those whiskey-colored eyes and said, "My responsibility now." The possessiveness in his tone should have angered her. Instead, it sent warmth spiraling through her chest in ways that made her evening prayers increasingly difficult to focus on. Sister Mercy. Maria Martinez appeared in the chapel doorway, cradling her infant son. The young mother had been coming daily since her grandfather's funeral, seeking comfort in the routine of prayer. "Might I speak with you?" "Of course." Mercy set aside her mending and gestured to one of the newly repaired pews. "How are you managing?" Maria settled beside her, the baby gurgling contentedly in her arms. "It's not grandfather's passing that troubles me, sister. It's the talk in town." A knot formed in Mercy's stomach. "What kind of talk?" "About you, about who you were before." Maria's dark eyes were filled with concern rather than judgment. "Sheriff Coleman has been asking questions, and some folks are saying maybe the church should find a different sister to tend the chapel." The words hit Mercy like physical blows. She'd known this moment would come eventually, the moment when her carefully constructed new life would crumble under the weight of her past. But she hadn't expected it to hurt quite so much. "I see. I don't care what you did before," Maria said fiercely. "You've been nothing but kind to our family. You held my hand when little Jose had the fever, and you helped prepare grandfather for his final journey. That's all that matters to me." Tears pricked at Mercy's eyes. "Thank you, Maria. That means more than you know, but there's something else." Maria lowered her voice, glancing toward the door where Weston's shadow occasionally passed. Mr. Hart has been making his own inquiries, asking questions about those men who attacked you, about who might have sent them. Mercy's heart began to race. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he's not content to let this matter rest. The kind that might bring more trouble down on all of us. Before Mercy could respond, Weston himself appeared in the doorway. He'd removed his hat and vest in deference to the morning heat, and his white shirt clung to the broad expanse of his chest in ways that made Mercy's mouth go dry. There was something different about him today, a tension in his shoulders, a hardness around his eyes that spoke of difficult decisions made in the dark, hours before dawn. "Ladies," he nodded respectfully to both women, but his gaze lingered on Mercy. "Maria, how's that baby of yours?" "Growing stronger every day, thanks to Sister Mercy's prayers." Maria rose, recognizing the unspoken request for privacy. "I should be getting home. José will want his feeding soon." After she left, silence stretched between Mercy and Weston like a taut wire. He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and sage that seemed permanently embedded in his skin, close enough to see the small scar along his jaw that spoke of past violence. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "About what?" "About the fact that those men who attacked you weren't working alone. About the fact that there's still a bounty on Elizabeth Morrison's head, and half the territory knows exactly where to find her now." Mercy's hands clenched in her lap. "You've been investigating." "Damn right I have." Weston pulled his journal from his pocket and flipped it open to a page covered in notes written in his bold, masculine handwriting. Charlie Briggs, the leader of that group, had connections to the Valdez gang out of Arizona. "They've been tracking you for months, following rumors of Johnny Morrison's widow. I told you I don't know anything about Johnny's money. Doesn't matter what you know. Matters what they think you know." Weston sat beside her on the pew, the warmth of his body making her acutely aware of how long it had been since she'd felt truly safe with another person. "The Valdez gang doesn't give up easy. They'll send more men." Fear clawed at Mercy's throat. "Then I'll leave. Tonight. I'll go somewhere they can't find me." "No." The word came out with such quiet force that Mercy actually flinched. "You're not running anymore. It's not your decision to make." Weston turned to face her fully, his hands capturing hers before she could pull away. His touch was warm, calloused, infinitely gentle despite the strength she could feel in his fingers. "Isn't it?" His thumb traced across her knuckles, sending shivers up her arm. "You wear that habit like armor, Mercy, but underneath it, you're still a woman who needs protecting, a woman who deserves protecting." "I'm a nun," she whispered, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Are you?" His free hand came up to cup her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Because when I look at you, I don't see Sister Mercy Langford, devoted servant of God. I see Elizabeth Morrison, a woman who's been running so long she's forgotten how to stand and fight." The use of her real name sent shockwaves through her system. No one had called her Elizabeth in 3 years. Hearing it on his lips made her feel like she was waking up from a long, dreamless sleep. "You don't understand," she said desperately. "You don't know what I've done, what I was part of. Then tell me." His hands tightened on hers, anchoring her to the present moment. "Tell me everything and let me decide what I can live with." For a moment, Mercy teetered on the edge of confession. The urge to unburden herself, to share the weight she'd been carrying alone for so long, was almost overwhelming. But the chapel walls seemed to lean in around them, reminding her of the vows she'd taken, the life she'd chosen. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't be what you want me to be." Something shifted in Weston's expression, disappointment perhaps, or recognition of a battle that would take more time to win. But he didn't let go of her hands. "You're wrong about that, darling. You already are exactly what I want." He stood slowly, releasing her with obvious reluctance. "But when you're ready to stop hiding behind those robes and start living again, you know where to find me." He headed for the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "And Mercy, Whether you want my protection or not, you have it. Those men come back. They'll have to go through me first." After he left, Mercy remained on the pew with her hands pressed to her burning cheeks. Outside, she could hear him giving instructions to his workers, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man accustomed to command. But here, in the chapel's silence, all she could think about was the way he'd said her name, Elizabeth, like it was something precious he'd been saving for the right moment. Father Miguel found her there an hour later, still sitting motionless among the wildflowers she'd forgotten to arrange. "Difficult choices ahead," he said simply, settling beside her with a grunt. "How do you know when you're fighting for righteousness and when you're just being selfish?" Mercy asked. The old priest was quiet for a long moment. "In my experience, God rarely asks us to choose between love and duty. Usually, he asks us to find a way to honor both. And if that's impossible, then perhaps we're not asking the right questions." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the chapel floor, Mercy found herself holding Weston's blood-stained handkerchief against her cheek. The cotton still carried his scent, leather and sage, and something uniquely masculine that made her heart race. Through the window, she could see lights beginning to flicker on in the town below. Somewhere out there, Weston Hart was thinking about her, planning ways to keep her safe, whether she wanted his protection or not. Somewhere beyond the horizon, dangerous men were planning ways to drag her back into a past she'd spent 3 years trying to escape. And here, in this broken chapel with its melted bell and scarred walls, Sister Mercy Langford was discovering that the heart doesn't recognize the difference between sacred and profane when it comes to love. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but all she could think about was the way Weston's hands had felt on hers, warm and strong and infinitely protective. All she could remember was the promise in his voice when he'd said she belonged to him. Maybe Father Miguel was right. Maybe the questions she'd been asking weren't the right ones. Maybe the real question wasn't whether she could afford to love Weston Hart. Maybe it was whether she could afford not to. The faded wedding photograph had been hidden beneath the false bottom of Mercy's small wooden trunk for 3 years. She'd thought about burning it 100 times, but something always stopped her. Perhaps the need to remember what love had looked like before it curdled into fear, or maybe just the stubborn human tendency to hold on to pieces of the past, even the painful ones. Now, as she stared down at the young woman in the white dress standing beside Johnny Morrison, Mercy could barely recognize herself. Elizabeth Catherine had been so naive, so trusting, with bright eyes that held no shadows and a smile that spoke of endless possibilities. The man beside her was handsome in the way that outlaws often were, charming, dangerous, with the kind of magnetism that drew women like moths to flame. She'd loved him once. Truly, desperately loved him, right up until the night she'd discovered what he kept in the locked chest beneath their bed. Bank robbery proceeds, bloody clothing, and a collection of wanted posters that made her realize she'd married a stranger who wore her husband's face. "Mercy?" Father Miguel's voice drifted through the chapel's thin walls. "Are you well, child?" She quickly tucked the photograph back into its hiding place and smoothed her habit. "Yes, Father, just organizing my things." It was Sunday morning, and the chapel would soon fill with the handful of faithful who made the trek from town for weekly services. Mercy had grown to treasure these gatherings, the simple hymns sung by weathered voices, the way even the hardest men removed their hats and spoke in respectful whispers within the sacred walls. But today felt different. Today, she knew that when Weston Hart walked through those chapel doors, everything between them would change. The attack had stripped away pretenses, laid bare truths that could no longer be hidden behind religious vows and careful distance. The first families began arriving as the sun reached its zenith, their Sunday clothes marking a stark contrast to the rough work garments they wore the rest of the week. Maria Martinez came with little Jose, followed by the Hendersons and old Mrs. Rodriguez, who always insisted on sitting in the front pew despite her failing hearing. Then Weston arrived, and Mercy's breath caught in her throat. He dressed for church in a way that made her hands tremble, black trousers that emphasized the length of his legs, a crisp white shirt that set off his tanned skin, and a black vest that somehow made his shoulders look even broader. His dark hair was still slightly damp from washing, and he'd shaved, revealing the strong line of his jaw and the sensual curve of his mouth. But it was his eyes that undid her completely. They found her the moment he entered the chapel, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her forget, for a dangerous moment, that they had an audience. "Sister Mercy," he said quietly, removing his hat and moving to take a seat in the last pew. "Mr. Hart." Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Welcome." Father Miguel began the service with the opening hymn, his wavering voice joined by the small congregation. Mercy tried to focus on the familiar words, on the comfort of routine and ritual, but she was acutely aware of Weston's presence behind her. She could feel his eyes on her as she helped distribute communion, sense his attention like a physical touch when she read from the scriptures. During Father Miguel's sermon about redemption and second chances, Mercy found herself thinking about the photograph hidden in her trunk, about the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming, about the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, love didn't have to end in betrayal and bloodshed. After the service ended and the congregation began to file out, Weston lingered. He helped stack the worn hymnals and straighten the pews, moving with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. When the last parishioner had departed and Father Miguel had retreated to his small quarters behind the altar, Mercy found herself alone with the man who'd been occupying her thoughts for days. "You look tired," he said gently, moving closer. "Not sleeping well?" Mercy's hand went instinctively to the cross at her throat. "I sleep fine, liar." But he said it with such warmth that it felt like an endearment. "You've got shadows under your eyes deep enough to hide secrets in." "Maybe because I have secrets to hide." Weston's expression grew serious. "Then maybe it's time to share some of them, with someone who won't judge you for your past." Before Mercy could respond, the chapel door burst open with enough force to rattle the hinges. Sheriff Coleman stood in the doorway, his badge glinting in the afternoon sunlight, and his expression grim as winter. "Sister Mercy," he said formally, "I need to speak with you." Weston stepped slightly in front of her, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the sheriff. "About what, Coleman?" "About Elizabeth Morrison and the reward money that's being offered for information about her whereabouts." The sheriff's pale eyes fixed on Mercy with uncomfortable intensity. "Seems someone in Santa Fe is very interested in having a conversation with Johnny Morrison's widow." Mercy's blood turned to ice. "I told you, Sheriff, my husband is dead. Whatever he did. What he did was steal $50,000 from the Territorial Bank 3 months before he died. Money that was never recovered." Coleman stepped into the chapel, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Money that his widow might know something about." "She's told you she doesn't know anything about stolen money," Weston said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "Seems like that should be the end of it." "Would be if she was just Sister Mercy Langford, nun and servant of God." Coleman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "But she's not, is she? She's Elizabeth Morrison, wanted for questioning in connection with multiple felonies." "Wanted by who?" Weston's hand had moved to rest on his own weapon, and Mercy could see the tension coiling in his shoulders like a spring under pressure. "Federal Marshal out of Denver. Seems Mrs. Morrison here was seen leaving the bank in Alamosa the day before it was robbed. Seen talking to men who matched the description of her husband's gang." Coleman's eyes never left Mercy's face. "Mighty interesting coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Mercy felt the walls of the chapel closing in around her. She'd been to that bank, had withdrawn money for supplies, while Johnny conducted what he'd claimed was legitimate business in town. She hadn't known about the robbery until days later, hadn't realized that her presence there would be remembered, noted, filed away as evidence of complicity. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear before God, I didn't know what they were planning." "Maybe not, But a federal judge will want to hear that directly from you. Coleman's hand tightened on his gun. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come with me, sister. There's a U.S. Marshal waiting in town with some questions. No. The word came from Weston, quiet but absolute. She's not going anywhere. Coleman's eyebrows rose. That's so. You planning to interfere with federal law enforcement, Hart? I'm planning to make sure she gets fair treatment, which she won't get if you hand her over to bounty hunters looking to collect reward money. The two men faced each other across the chapel's stone floor, hands hovering near weapons, the air thick with the promise of violence. Mercy could see how this would end gunfire in a sacred space, blood on consecrated ground, all because she'd been too much of a coward to face her past. Stop! She stepped between them, her voice carrying an authority she didn't know she possessed. Both of you, just stop. She looked at Coleman, then at Weston, seeing the same stubborn protectiveness in both men's eyes. One was trying to uphold the law, the other to shield her from its consequences, but both were prepared to die for their principles. Sheriff Coleman, if there's a federal marshal who wants to question me, then I'll answer his questions. But I want a lawyer present, and I want Mr. Hart there as well. Mercy, Weston started to protest. No. She turned to face him, her decision crystallizing even as she spoke. I'm tired of running, tired of hiding behind these walls and these robes. If I'm going to have any chance at a real life, any life, I need to face this. Coleman nodded slowly. Fair enough, but you understand, sister, that once we start down this road, there's no going back. Whatever protection your religious vows offered you disappears the moment you walk into that marshal's office as Elizabeth Morrison. Mercy looked around the chapel that had been her sanctuary for 3 months at the melted bell that spoke of survival through fire. At the altar where she'd knelt in prayer so many times, at the pews where she'd tried to find peace in service to God. Then she looked at Weston, saw the fierce devotion in his eyes, the promise that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. I understand, she said quietly, but I'm not Sister Mercy Langford anymore. Maybe I never really was. She reached up and slowly removed her wimple, letting her dark hair fall free around her shoulders for the first time in 3 years. The simple gesture felt like shedding skin, like being reborn into a life she'd never dared to imagine. I'm Elizabeth Morrison, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, and I'm ready to tell my story. Coleman looked between her and Weston, recognition dawning in his eyes. This wasn't just about stolen money or federal warrants anymore. This was about a woman choosing love over safety, truth over hiding. Tomorrow morning, then, he said finally, 10 o'clock at my office. After he left, Mercy stood in the middle of the chapel with her hair loose and her heart racing. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also strangely free, as if removing that simple piece of cloth had lifted a weight she'd carried for too long. Weston moved toward her slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. When he reached her, he didn't speak, didn't touch her. He simply stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that his presence felt like an anchor in the storm that was surely coming. You know what this means, she said quietly. It means you're choosing to stop running. His hand came up to touch a strand of her dark hair, his fingers reverent, as if he were handling something precious. It means you're choosing to trust me to keep you safe. And if I can't give you what you want, if the church, the law, my past, if it all comes between us, Weston's thumb traced the curve of her cheek, wiping away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. Then we'll face it together, all of it. Because you belong to me now, Elizabeth Morrison, and I don't give up what's mine without a fight. She closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, letting herself feel, for the first time in years, what it meant to be protected by someone who loved her enough to face down the world itself. When she opened her eyes again, the chapel looked different, not like a sanctuary where she'd been hiding, but like the place where her real life had finally begun. The silver locket had belonged to her mother, a delicate piece of jewelry that contained a miniature portrait of Elizabeth as a child, painted when she was 7 years old and still believed the world was full of fairy tale endings. It was the only thing of value she'd managed to save from her previous life, hidden away like everything else that connected her to the woman she'd been before. Johnny Morrison destroyed her faith in love. Now, sitting in Sheriff Coleman's office with Weston beside her and a federal marshal across the desk, Elizabeth found herself fingering the locket's chain through the fabric of her dress, the only civilian clothes she owned, a simple blue cotton that she'd worn on the train to New Mexico 3 years ago. Marshal William Garrett was a lean man with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's darker nature. He'd been questioning her for 2 hours, his voice patient but relentless as he walked her through every detail of her marriage to Johnny Morrison. "So you're telling me, Mrs. Morrison, that in 6 months of marriage, your husband never once mentioned his criminal activities, never brought home unexplained money or weapons?" Elizabeth's hand tightened on the locket. "Johnny told me he was a cattle broker. He traveled frequently for business, sometimes for weeks at a time. I thought I wanted to believe he was legitimate. Even when he started bringing home gold coins, Federal Reserve notes, money that couldn't be explained by cattle sales." Beside her, Weston shifted in his chair, his presence a steady comfort that kept her grounded. His own clothes were formal, a black suit that made him look like a prosperous rancher rather than the dangerous man she'd seen defend her chapel with deadly efficiency. "I asked him about the money," Elizabeth admitted. "He said he'd made some good investments, found some buyers willing to pay premium prices for quality stock. And you believed him?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Elizabeth closed her eyes, remembering the woman she'd been at 25, trusting, naive, desperate to believe in the charming man who'd swept her off her feet in a St. Louis ballroom. "I wanted to believe him," she said quietly. "I'd lost my father the year before, lost the family business to creditors. Johnny represented security, a fresh start. So yes, Marshal Garrett, I believed him because the alternative was admitting I'd married a stranger. When did you first suspect he wasn't what he claimed to be?" Elizabeth's fingers found the locket's clasp, opening and closing it in a nervous rhythm. 3 weeks before he died. I found a chest hidden under our bed. Money, jewelry, things that obviously didn't belong to him. When I confronted him about it, he became violent. Weston's hand found hers under the table, warm and steady. The simple contact gave her strength to continue. "He hit me, told me that if I ever questioned him again, if I ever tried to leave him, he'd kill me. That's when I knew I'd married a monster." Marshal Garrett's expression softened slightly. "Is that when you started planning to leave?" "Yes. I was going to take the train back to St. Louis the day after he was killed. I'd already purchased the ticket, but instead you went to a convent in Santa Fe. Instead, I discovered that being married to an outlaw meant I was suspected of being one too. The local sheriff suggested I might be safer if I disappeared for a while." The marshal made notes in his ledger, his pen scratching against paper in the quiet office. Outside, the sounds of Espiranza's daily life continued: horses on the street, voices calling to each other, the normal rhythm of a frontier town going about its business. "Tell me about the Alamosa bank visit." Elizabeth's heart began to race. This was the question she'd been dreading, the incident that had brought federal attention to her case. Johnny said he had business there, something about buying breeding stock from a rancher outside town. He asked me to withdraw travel money from our account while he met with his contact. "How much money?" $500 for supplies and lodging on the trail. "And you didn't think it odd that he sent you to the bank while he conducted his business elsewhere?" "I thought," Elizabeth's voice caught, "I thought he was being considerate, keeping me away from the rougher aspects of cattle trading." The truth was more complicated than that. Johnny had been different that day, nervous, excited, the way he got when he was planning something big. She'd sensed the change in him, but had attributed it to the stress of a major business deal. "The bank was robbed the next day," Marshal Garrett said quietly. $50,000, taken by 3 men who matched the description of known associates of your husband. One of the tellers identified you from a photograph as the woman who'd been asking questions about the bank's security procedures. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. That's not true. I asked no questions about security. The teller says you inquired about their hours, their procedures for large withdrawals. I asked when they opened because I wanted to conduct my business early and avoid crowds. I asked about withdrawal limits because $500 was the largest amount I'd ever taken at one time. Elizabeth's voice grew stronger as indignation replaced fear. I was a nervous young woman trying to manage her husband's finances, not a criminal planning a robbery. Weston squeezed her hand under the table, a silent show of support that gave her courage to continue. Marshal, with respect, if I'd been planning to help rob that bank, would I have used my real name? Would I have let myself be seen and remembered by the staff? Would I have withdrawn money the day before the robbery, creating a clear connection between myself and the crime? For the first time since the questioning began, Marshal Garrett looked uncertain. These are valid points, Mrs. Morrison. My wife is not a criminal, Weston said quietly, speaking for the first time since the interrogation began. She's a woman who made the mistake of trusting the wrong man and has spent 3 years paying for that mistake. The marshal's eyebrows rose. Your wife? Elizabeth felt heat flood her cheeks. We're not married yet. Yet? Marshal Garrett looked between them with new interest. Mr. Hart, you're prepared to marry a woman who's wanted for questioning in multiple federal crimes? I'm prepared to marry the woman I love, Weston replied with quiet dignity, and to stand by her while she faces accusations based on nothing more than guilt by association. Elizabeth's heart swelled at his words, at the absolute certainty in his voice. He'd called her his wife, as if it were already settled, as if no power on earth could prevent their union. Marshal Garrett, she said, finding her voice again, I'll submit to any investigation you deem necessary. I'll answer any questions, take any oath, provide any documentation you require, but I want it on record that I never participated in, planned, or benefited from my husband's criminal activities. I was his victim, not his accomplice. The marshal studied her for a long moment, his experienced eyes searching her face for signs of deception. Finally, he closed his ledger and leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Morrison, I've been hunting outlaws for 20 years, and I've developed a sense for guilt versus innocence. You don't strike me as a woman capable of planning complex criminal enterprises. Relief flooded through Elizabeth so powerfully that she nearly sobbed. Thank you. However, the marshal continued, there are still people who believe Johnny Morrison's gang had help from someone with inside knowledge of banking procedures. Until we can prove otherwise, you'll need to remain available for further questioning. Rebard problems, meaning she can't leave the territory, Weston said. Meaning she stays where we can find her if new evidence surfaces. Marshal Garrett stood, signaling the end of the interview. Mrs. Morrison, I suggest you think carefully about your future plans. Being married to one outlaw was unfortunate. Becoming involved with another would be inadvisable. Weston rose slowly, his hand moving to rest on his gun belt. Are you suggesting something about my character, Marshal? I'm suggesting that a man who solves problems with violence, regardless of his reasons, might not be the best choice for a woman trying to distance herself from criminal activity. Elizabeth stood quickly, placing herself between the two men before the tension could escalate further. Marshal Garrett, Mr. Hart is an honorable man who's done nothing but protect me from real criminals. I'd trust him with my life. You may be doing exactly that, the marshal replied, more than you realize. After they left the sheriff's office, Elizabeth and Weston walked toward the chapel in silence. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Elizabeth could feel sweat gathering beneath the high collar of her dress. She missed the practical simplicity of her nun's habit, but more than that, she missed the protection it had offered, the assumption of innocence that came with religious vows. What did he mean? She asked finally. About you solving problems with violence? Weston was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. Before I inherited the ranch, I spent some time working for people who needed problems solved quietly. Problems that couldn't be handled through legal channels. Elizabeth stopped walking. What kind of problems? The kind that sometimes required a gun. Weston turned to face her, his eyes holding hers steadily. I'm not proud of everything I've done, Elizabeth, but I've never killed a man who didn't deserve killing, and I've never taken money for anything that wasn't justice in the end. She studied his face, seeing the honesty there, the regret, but also the strength that had drawn her to him from the beginning. This was what Marshal Garrett had been warning her about, the fact that Weston Hart was not a safe, civilized man, but something wilder and more dangerous. Are you afraid of me now? He asked quietly. Elizabeth reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. No, I'm afraid for you. I'm afraid that protecting me will cost you everything you've built here. Let me worry about that. He lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. The only thing I'm worried about is keeping you safe long enough to make you my wife. That evening, as Elizabeth sat in the chapel watching the sun set over the mesas, she opened her mother's locket and stared at the miniature portrait inside. The child in the painting looked so hopeful, so trusting, with no idea of the pain and loss that lay ahead. But maybe that was the point. Maybe faith wasn't about knowing the future would be safe, but about choosing to love anyway, choosing to trust anyway, choosing to hope for something better even when experience suggested otherwise. She thought about Weston's confession, about the violence in his past, and the protection he offered for her future. She thought about Marshal Garrett's warnings and the federal warrant that still hung over her head like a sword. And she realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She was ready to fight for love, even if it meant losing everything else. Weston's father's pocket watch had stopped working 3 years ago, but he still carried it everywhere, a silver timepiece engraved with the Hart family crest and his father's initials. Thomas Hart had been a man of rigid principles and unwavering expectations, the kind of patriarch who believed that family legacy was worth more than individual happiness. The watch had been his way of reminding his son that time was precious, that every moment should be spent building something worthy of the Hart name. Now, as Weston sat in the parlor of his ranch house with that same watch in his hands, he could almost hear his father's voice echoing through the rooms. A Hart man protects what's his. Son, but he also knows when to walk away from a fight he can't win. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was about to do the exact opposite of everything his father had taught him. Instead of choosing a wife from among the territory's respectable families, he was planning to marry a woman with a federal warrant hanging over her head. Instead of avoiding scandal, he was courting it with open arms. A knock at the front door interrupted his brooding. Maria Martinez stood on the porch, cradling little Jose and looking more nervous than he'd ever seen the usually composed young mother. "Mr. Hart, I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to speak with you about Sister, about Elizabeth." Weston gestured her inside, noting how she stumbled over the name change. The entire town was struggling to adjust to the revelation that their gentle nun had been hiding such a dramatic secret. "What's troubling you, Maria?" She settled into the leather chair across from him, the baby gurgling contentedly in her arms. "It's the church officials. They arrived this morning from Santa Fe, Bishop Calderon and 2 other priests. They're asking questions about Elizabeth, about her time at the chapel." Weston felt ice form in his stomach. What kind of questions? Whether she was truly devout, whether she showed signs of improper attachment to worldly concerns. Maria's cheeks flushed. "They've heard about you, Mr. Hart. About your visits to the chapel, about the way you look at her. And what did you tell them?" "The truth, that she's been nothing but kind and faithful in her service. That she helped my family when grandfather was dying, that she never showed anything but proper devotion to her duties." Maria paused, then added quietly, "But Mr. Hart, I don't think they believe me. I think they've already made up their minds." Weston set the pocket watch on the side table with deliberate care. What do you mean? I mean they're talking about taking her back to Santa Fe for disciplinary proceedings. They're saying that a woman who would abandon her religious vows for earthly love was never truly called to serve God in the first place. The words hit Weston like physical blows. He'd known this moment would come, the moment when Elizabeth's two worlds would collide and force her to choose between the life she'd built and the love they'd found together. But he hadn't expected it to come so soon, or with such finality. They can't force her to return, he said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. Can't they? She took vows, Mr. Hart, sacred vows. The church has authority over its own members. Weston stood and moved to the window, staring out at the vast expanse of his ranch. Cattle dotted the landscape like dark specks against the golden grass, and the mountains rose in the distance like ancient guardians. This land had been in his family for 2 generations, built with blood and sweat, and the kind of single-minded determination that brooked no compromise. His father had expected him to marry Sarah Mitchell, the banker's daughter from Santa Fe, a sensible woman with good breeding and no complications. He was supposed to produce heirs, to carry on the Hart legacy, expand the ranch holdings, maybe run for territorial office someday. A respectable life, built on respectable foundations. Instead, he'd fallen in love with a woman who came with more complications than a man could navigate in 3 lifetimes. "Maria," he said without turning around, "what do you think of Elizabeth? Not as a nun, but as a woman?" The young mother was quiet for a moment. "I think she's been hurt deeply, and I think she's trying very hard to be good despite that hurt. I think she cares more about others than herself, and I think she's stronger than she knows. Do you think she loves me?" "Mr. Hart, I think she loves you so much it terrifies her. I think she's spent 3 years believing she didn't deserve happiness, and now that she's found it, she doesn't know what to do with it." Weston turned back to Maria, his mind already working through the implications of what she'd told him. "These church officials, where are they staying?" "The hotel in town. But Mr. Hart, you can't, whatever you're thinking, violence won't solve this problem." "Won't it?" Weston's voice carried a hardness that made Maria shift nervously in her chair. "Seems to me violence is the only language some people understand. Elizabeth wouldn't want you to fight her battles for her. Elizabeth doesn't get a choice in this." Weston moved to the gun cabinet in the corner of the room, his hands steady as he selected his father's old army Colt. "She's mine to protect now, and I protect what's mine." Maria stood quickly, little José startling in her arms as he sensed his mother's agitation. "Mr. Hart, please, think about what you're doing. If you threaten church officials, you'll be playing right into their hands. They'll use it as proof that Elizabeth has been corrupted by worldly influences." Weston paused in loading the revolver, Maria's words cutting through his anger with uncomfortable clarity. She was right, of course. Any show of force would only confirm the church's suspicions about Elizabeth's moral failing. But that didn't mean he was powerless. "Thank you for warning me," he said, setting the gun aside. "And Maria, not a word of this conversation to anyone." After she left, Weston retrieved the pocket watch and wound it carefully, listening to its steady tick resume. His father had always said that timing was everything in business and war, that the man who moved too early or too late was the man who lost. The question was, what exactly was he fighting for? That evening found him at the chapel, where Elizabeth was arranging flowers on the altar with the same careful attention she'd always shown. She'd left her hair loose again, the dark waves catching the lamplight in ways that made his chest tighten with desire and possessiveness. "You're troubled," she said without looking up from the wildflowers. "I can hear it in your footsteps." "Church officials arrived from Santa Fe today." Her hands stilled. "I know. They came to see me this afternoon." Weston moved closer, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone bracing for a blow. "What did they want?" "To remind me of my vows, to discuss the irregularities in my behavior since arriving in Espiranza." She finally looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the pain he'd been dreading to see. "They want me to return to Santa Fe for a disciplinary hearing." What did you tell them? I told them I needed time to pray about it. Elizabeth's smile held no humor, which was diplomatically correct and completely dishonest. Since I've already made my decision. Weston's heart began to race. Which is, I'm going with them. The words hit him like a physical blow. Like hell you are. Weston, please. She moved toward him, her hands reaching for his, but he stepped back, unable to bear her touch when she was planning to leave him. You're going to let them drag you back there? Let them punish you for the crime of wanting to be happy? I'm going to face the consequences of my choices. Her voice was steady, but he could see the tears she was fighting. I took vows, Weston. Sacred vows that I abandoned the moment I let myself feel something for you. Those vows were a lie, and you know it. Weston's control finally snapped, his voice echoing through the chapel. You didn't join the church because of some divine calling. You joined because you were running from your past, hiding from the world, using God as an excuse to stop living. Elizabeth flinched as if he'd struck her. That's not fair, isn't it? When's the last time you felt God's presence in this chapel, Elizabeth? When's the last time your prayers brought you peace instead of guilt? He moved closer, backing her against the altar. When's the last time you felt truly alive before I walked through that door? It doesn't matter what I felt. It matters what I promised. To who? To a God who let you suffer through 6 months of marriage to a monster? To a church that's ready to punish you for finding love? Weston's hands framed her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. Or to yourself, because you're still convinced you don't deserve to be happy. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks, and Weston felt something break inside his chest. This was what he'd been fighting against all along, not the church, not the law, not even Elizabeth's past, but her own inability to believe she was worthy of love. I destroyed everything I touched before, she whispered. My father's business, my marriage, everyone who trusted me. You were 25 years old and married to a criminal who lied to you about everything. None of that was your fault. But what if it happens again? What if I bring the same destruction to you, to this town, to everyone who's been kind to me? Weston pulled her against him, holding her while she sobbed against his chest. Then we'll face it together, all of it. But Elizabeth, if you run now, if you let them take you back to that convent, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. She pulled back to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face. And if I stay, if I choose you over my vows, what then? Then we get married tomorrow morning. We build a life together on this ranch. We have children and watch them grow up under these stars. His thumb traced the curve of her cheek. We have 40 or 50 years to figure out the rest. The church won't just let me go. They'll make trouble for you, for the town. Let them try. Weston's voice carried all the deadly certainty that had made him feared throughout the territory. I've been handling trouble my whole life, darling. A few angry priests don't scare me. Elizabeth closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. My father's watch stopped 3 years ago, the day I learned about Johnny's true nature. I've carried it with me ever since, thinking time had stopped for me too, thinking I was frozen in that moment of betrayal and loss. She opened her eyes and looked at him with something that might have been hope. But maybe time only stops when we stop living. Maybe it's never too late to start again. Weston felt his heart begin to beat normally for the first time since Maria's visit. Is that a yes, Mrs. Hart? That's a yes to everything, Mr. Hart. To marriage, to children, to 40 years of figuring things out together. She rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. But first, you have to help me find the courage to tell 3 very angry priests that they're going home without me. Weston kissed her back, deeper this time, claiming her mouth with all the possessive hunger he'd been holding in check for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. Leave the priests to me, he said. I've got some things to explain to them about territorial law and the rights of free citizens. As they stood together in the lamplight, surrounded by the flowers Elizabeth had arranged, and the broken beauty of the chapel that had brought them together, Weston could almost hear his father's pocket watch ticking again, marking time not as something to be preserved or feared, but as something to be lived, fully and completely, with the woman he loved by his side. The wanted poster arrived with the morning mail, carried by a dusty rider who'd pushed his horse hard from Santa Fe. Sheriff Coleman found it waiting on his desk when he arrived at his office, the paper still crisp despite the long journey, the ink dark and unforgiving beneath the territorial seal. But this wasn't the old poster he'd seen before, the one seeking Elizabeth Morrison for questioning in connection with bank robberies. This was something new, something that made Coleman's blood run cold as he read the details. Wanted. Elizabeth Catherine Morrison, also known as Sister Mercy Langford, for murder in the first degree. Reward: 1. 0 dead or alive. The description was detailed and accurate, down to the small scar above Elizabeth's left eyebrow and the way she favored her right hand. But it was the crime description that made Coleman reach for his whiskey bottle despite the early hour. Suspect wanted in connection with the murder of Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrett, Denver, Colorado Territory. Marshal Garrett was found shot to death in his hotel room on the night of March 15, 1882. Witnesses placed suspect at the scene, armed and extremely dangerous. Coleman stared at the paper for a long moment, his mind racing. Marshal William Garrett, the federal officer who'd questioned Elizabeth just 3 days ago, had a brother named Thomas who'd been killed 2 years ago in Denver. The timing was all wrong, but the implications were terrifying. Someone was hunting Elizabeth Morrison with enough resources to forge federal documents and enough motivation to frame her for murder. A commotion outside drew his attention to the window. A crowd was gathering in the street, and in the center of it stood 3 men. Coleman didn't recognize well-dressed, well-armed, and wearing the kind of confident smiles that meant trouble for everyone else. The leader was a tall man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, dressed like a successful businessman, but carrying himself like a professional killer. His companions were younger, harder-looking men, who kept their hands near their weapons and their eyes on the crowd. "Sheriff Coleman?" The silver-haired man's voice carried the accent of educated money, East Coast sophistication transplanted to the frontier. "I'm Clayton Barrows, representing certain interests in Denver. I believe you have something that belongs to us." Coleman folded the wanted poster and slipped it into his vest pocket. "Depends what you're looking for. Elizabeth Morrison. We understand she's been hiding in your territory under the name Sister Mercy Langford. What's your interest in Mrs. Morrison?" Barrows's smile was cold as winter wind. "She murdered a federal officer, Sheriff. My associates and I are here to collect the bounty and ensure she faces territorial justice." Something in the man's tone made Coleman's instincts scream danger. These weren't lawmen or even ordinary bounty hunters. They moved like soldiers, spoke like businessmen, and radiated the kind of controlled violence that came from years of organized killing. "I'll need to see some identification," Coleman said carefully, "and proper warrants." "Of course." Barrows produced a leather folder containing what appeared to be legitimate territorial commission papers and a federal arrest warrant. "Everything's in order, I assure you." Coleman studied the documents, noting the official seals and signatures. They looked genuine, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. The timing, the men, the convenient appearance of a murder charge just days after Elizabeth had been questioned by federal authorities. "Where is she, Sheriff?" one of Barrow's companions asked impatiently. "We know she's been living at that burnt chapel outside town." "Was living there. She's moved on." Barrow's eyes narrowed. "Moved on where?" "Can't say. People come and go in this territory all the time." "Sheriff," Barrow's voice took on a dangerous edge, "I'd hate to have to report to my superiors that local law enforcement was obstructing a federal investigation. Bad things tend to happen to sheriffs who don't cooperate with territorial authorities." Coleman felt his hand drift toward his gun. "Is that a threat, Mr. Barrows?" It's a professional courtesy, a suggestion that you might want to reconsider your position before this situation becomes unpleasant. Before Coleman could respond, the office door burst open. Weston Hart strode in with Elizabeth beside him, both of them moving with the urgent energy of people who'd received bad news and were ready to face it head-on. "Sheriff, we need to talk about." Weston stopped mid-sentence as he took in the three strangers, his hand instinctively moving to his gun belt. Elizabeth went pale as death when she saw Barrows, recognition flashing in her dark eyes like lightning before a storm. "Hello, Elizabeth." Barrows' voice carried mock warmth. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough," she whispered, stepping closer to Weston's protective bulk. Coleman watched the exchange with growing unease. These people knew each other, and the knowledge obviously terrified Elizabeth in ways that federal warrants and church discipline had not. "You two are acquainted?" he asked. "Oh yes," Barrows said, his cold smile never wavering. "Elizabeth and I go way back, don't we, dear? Back to when she was married to Johnny Morrison and helping him plan bank robberies across 3 territories." "That's a lie," Elizabeth said, but her voice shook with fear rather than indignation. "Is it? Then perhaps you'd like to explain how Johnny always knew exactly which banks to hit, exactly when they'd have the most cash on hand, exactly how many guards would be present." Barrows pulled out a small leather notebook and flipped it open. Information that could only have come from someone with access to banking correspondence and railroad schedules. Weston stepped forward, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "Mister, I don't know who you are or what game you're playing, but you're making accusations against my future wife without evidence." "Evidence?" Barrows laughed. "I have Elizabeth's own handwriting, Mr. Hart. Letters she sent to her husband detailing bank security procedures, guard rotations, cash shipment schedules. Quite detailed letters, actually, very helpful for planning robberies." Elizabeth made a sound like a wounded animal. "Those letters, they weren't. I didn't know what he was using them for." "What letters?" Weston demanded, looking between Elizabeth and Barrows with growing confusion. "Tell him, Elizabeth," Barrows said pleasantly. "Tell him about your little correspondence with Johnny while he was on the road. Tell him how you gathered information from bank managers and railroad officials during your social visits. Tell him how helpful you were to your husband's criminal enterprise." Elizabeth's knees nearly buckled. "I thought he said he was trying to start a legitimate business. He asked me to make social calls, to gather information about banking procedures and railroad schedules for potential investments. I didn't know he was using it to plan robberies." "Convenient ignorance," Barrows said. "The territorial court will find it fascinating, I'm sure." Coleman pulled the wanted poster from his pocket and handed it to Weston. "This arrived this morning." Weston read it quickly, his face darkening with each word. "Murder? Elizabeth, what is this about?" "I don't know," she said desperately. "I've never been to Denver, never killed anyone." "Haven't you?" Barrows interrupted. "What about Deputy Marshal Thomas Garrett? He was quite insistent about questioning you regarding your husband's activities, right up until someone put a bullet in his brain." "I've never heard of Thomas Garrett." Elizabeth's voice rose with panic. "I never met him, never spoke to him. The witnesses say otherwise. Hotel clerk places you in his room the night he died. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Weston's gun was in his hand so fast that Coleman barely saw him draw. The weapon was pointed at Barrows' chest, steady as stone. "That's enough," Weston said quietly. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but Elizabeth has never left this territory since arriving 3 years ago. She couldn't have killed anyone in Denver. Can you prove that, Mr. Hart?" Barrows seemed unconcerned by the gun pointed at his heart. "Can you account for her whereabouts every day and night for 3 years? Because I have witnesses who say otherwise." "Weston," Elizabeth whispered, her voice breaking. "The letters he mentioned, they exist. I did write to Johnny, did gather that information. But I swear to you, I thought I was helping him start a legitimate business." Weston's gun never wavered. "I believe you. The territorial court might not be so understanding," Barrows said, especially when they learn about the $50,000 that was never recovered from Johnny Morrison's robberies, money that his widow would have inherited. Elizabeth stared at him in shock. What money? Johnny died broke. There was nothing left after his debts were paid. According to who? The bank that held your accounts? The same bank that Johnny robbed 2 weeks before his death? Barrows' smile was triumphant. Oh yes, Elizabeth, we know about the private account, the one with your maiden name, the one that received regular deposits right up until Johnny's death. Coleman watched Elizabeth's face crumble as the full scope of Barrows's accusations sank in. This wasn't just about bounty money or federal warrants. This was a carefully constructed frame designed to destroy her completely. Who are you really? Coleman asked Barrows. Because you're not law enforcement. We represent private interests, Sheriff. People who lost a great deal of money thanks to Johnny Morrison's activities. People who believe his widow knows more than she's admitted about where that money went. What people? Weston demanded, his gun still trained on Barrows. The Cattlemen's Association of Colorado, the railroad companies, bank investors who lost everything when Morrison's gang hit their institutions. Barrows' voice carried the ring of truth, but Coleman could see the lies underneath. They've pooled resources to ensure justice is served. Elizabeth suddenly straightened, her fear replaced by something that looked like recognition. You're not here about justice. You're here about the Alamosa job. Barrows's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and hungry beneath the civilized veneer. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Elizabeth's voice grew stronger as understanding dawned. The Alamosa Bank wasn't just any bank. It was where the territorial governor kept his personal accounts, where certain people kept money they didn't want traced back to them. Coleman felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. What kind of money, Mrs. Morrison? Money from railroad contracts awarded without proper bidding. Money from land deals that displaced Indian tribes illegally. Money from mining claims filed under false names. Elizabeth looked directly at Barrows. Money that powerful people couldn't afford to have discovered during a federal investigation into Johnny's robberies. Barrows' hand moved toward his gun, but Weston's weapon swung to cover him. I wouldn't. Clever girl, Barrows said, his pretense of civility finally dropping. Always too clever for her own good. That's why you killed Johnny, isn't it? Elizabeth continued, her voice steady now despite the danger. Not because he robbed banks, but because he robbed the wrong bank, because he took money that belonged to your employers. Johnny Morrison died in a fair fight with a local sheriff, Barrows said carefully. Johnny Morrison died because someone tipped off the law about where he'd be that night, someone who knew his habits, his hiding places. Elizabeth's eyes blazed with righteous anger. You used me to get close to him, then you had him killed when he became a liability. Coleman's hand moved to his own weapon as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. And now you're trying to tie up loose ends. Now we're collecting what's ours, Barrows corrected. The money Johnny stole belongs to our employers. His widow is going to help us recover it. There is no money, Elizabeth shouted. If Johnny had $50,000, where is it? Where's the house, the horses, the jewelry? Where are the signs of wealth? Hidden somewhere safe, Barrows said. Somewhere Johnny would have told his devoted wife about before he died. He told me nothing because there was nothing to tell. We'll see about that. Barrows nodded to his companions. Gentlemen, I think it's time we concluded this discussion elsewhere. The two younger men reached for their guns, but they were facing Weston Hart, a man who'd been handling weapons since childhood and had never lost a gunfight in his life. His first shot took the man on the left in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the floor. His second shot shattered the gun hand of the man on the right before he could clear leather. Barrows drew his own weapon with impressive speed, but Coleman was ready for him. The sheriff's bullet caught the silver-haired man in the chest, dropping him to his knees, with blood spreading across his expensive shirt. Should have stuck to legitimate bounty hunting, Coleman said grimly. Barrows coughed, blood speckling his lips. You have no idea what you've done, what you've started. Enlighten us. Weston said, keeping his gun trained on the dying man. "There are others. More money involved than you can imagine." Barrow's voice was growing weaker. "Elizabeth Morrison will never be safe. Too many powerful people want their money back." "What money?" Elizabeth demanded, kneeling beside him. "Where is this supposed fortune Johnny stole?" Barrows looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You really don't know, do you? Your husband never told you about the insurance policy." "What insurance policy?" "The one naming you as beneficiary. The one worth $50,000. The one that pays out only if Johnny Morrison dies in the commission of a crime." Barrows smiled with his last breath. "Congratulations, Mrs. Morrison. You're worth a fortune to the wrong people." He died with that cold smile on his face, leaving Elizabeth staring down at him in shock. "An insurance policy," she whispered. "He took out an insurance policy on his own life and never told me." Coleman holstered his weapon and moved to check on Barrow's wounded companions. "That explains why they think you have the money. If the policy paid out, it would have gone to you as his legal widow." "But I never received any insurance money," Elizabeth protested. "I would have known. Not if it was paid to an account you didn't know about," Weston said grimly. "An account set up in your maiden name, like Barrows suggested." Elizabeth sank into a chair, the full implications hitting her like a physical blow. "They're going to keep coming. As long as they think I have that money, they're going to keep sending people like Barrows." "Then we need to find out if the money actually exists," Coleman said. "And if it does, we need to figure out where it went." Weston moved to Elizabeth's side, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "Whatever we find, we face it together." Elizabeth looked up at him, seeing the determination in his eyes, the unwavering loyalty that had never faltered despite all the revelations about her past. "Even if it means fighting powerful people, even if it means spending the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, especially then." Weston's hand cupped her face. "You belong to me now, darling, and I protect what's mine." As Sheriff Coleman began the grim work of cleaning up the aftermath of the gunfight, Elizabeth realized that her past hadn't finished with her yet. The wanted poster in Coleman's pocket might be fake, but the threat it represented was all too real. Somewhere out there, powerful people were still counting money they believed she'd stolen, and they weren't going to stop sending killers until they got it back. But for the first time since Johnny Morrison had died in that Dodge City saloon, Elizabeth wasn't running. She was ready to stand and fight for the life she'd found in Weston Hart's arms. Weston's Colt .45 revolver had been his constant companion for 15 years, a weapon that had never failed him in the moments when death balanced on the edge of a trigger pull. Tonight, as he cleaned and loaded it by lamplight in his ranch house, the familiar weight of the gun brought comfort rather than menace. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with forces that had been hunting Elizabeth across 3 territories, and he intended to be ready. The telegram from Denver had arrived that afternoon, carried by a rider who'd nearly killed his horse covering the distance in record time. Sheriff Coleman had brought it directly to the ranch, his weathered face grim as he handed over the yellow paper. "Stop. Insurance policy confirmed. Stop. 50,000 paid to account. Elizabeth Morrison. Maiden name stop account emptied same day Johnny died. Stop. Powerful people. Very angry. Stop. Large force headed your way. Stop. Suggest immediate relocation. Stop." The message was signed by Marshal William Garrett, the federal officer who'd questioned Elizabeth just days earlier. But it was the postscript that had made Weston's blood run cold. "Trust no one. In local law enforcement, stop corruption runs deep. Stop." "How many men?" Elizabeth had asked quietly after Coleman read the telegram aloud. "The wire doesn't say, but if they're willing to send a small army into territorial jurisdiction, we're looking at serious money behind this operation." Coleman's hand rested on his gun belt. "Professional killers, not just opportunistic bounty hunters like Barrows." Now, sitting in his parlour with weapons spread across the oak table his father had built by hand, Weston counted ammunition and considered strategy. Elizabeth sat beside him, her hair loose around her shoulders and her hands steady as she helped load cartridges. She'd changed into practical clothes, dark trousers and a cotton shirt that had belonged to his sister before consumption took her, and the transformation from nun to frontier woman was complete. "How many rounds do we have?" she asked, her voice calm despite the circumstances. 300 for the rifles, maybe 200 for the handguns." Weston set aside his father's old army Colt and reached for the Winchester. "Should be enough if we're smart about it." "And if we're not smart about it?" Weston looked at her across the table, noting the determined set of her jaw, the absence of fear in her dark eyes. This was the woman who'd survived 6 months, married to an outlaw, who'd built a new life from nothing, who'd faced down federal marshals and church officials without breaking. Whatever came tomorrow, she wouldn't run. "If we're not smart about it, then at least we'll go down fighting together." Elizabeth's hand found his across the table, her fingers intertwining with his. "Is that what you want? To die fighting for a woman you barely know?" "I know everything I need to know." Weston turned his hand to capture hers, feeling the calluses she'd developed from months of hard work at the chapel. "I know you're brave enough to face your past instead of running from it. I know you're kind enough to comfort dying strangers and strong enough to start over when everything you believed in crumbled. I know you love me enough to stay and fight instead of disappearing in the night. How can you be sure I won't run? Because you had a dozen chances to leave over the past weeks, and you're still here." Weston lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Because when Coleman told you about the force heading our way, the first thing you asked was how many men, not which direction led to safety." A knock at the front door interrupted them, and Weston was moving before the sound died, his gun in his hand and Elizabeth behind him as they approached the entrance. Voices on the porch, familiar voices, but speaking in urgent whispers. Weston opened the door to find Father Miguel, Maria Martinez, and half a dozen other townspeople standing in the darkness. They were armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, their faces set with grim determination. "We heard about the telegram," Father Miguel said simply. "We've come to help." "This isn't your fight," Weston replied, though warmth spread through his chest at the sight of neighbors willing to risk their lives for Elizabeth. "It became our fight the moment they threatened one of our own." Maria stepped forward, little Jose sleeping peacefully in her arms, despite the weapons surrounding him. "Elizabeth helped my family when grandfather was dying. She's been nothing but kind to this community. We won't stand by while hired killers hunt her down." "There could be 20 men coming," Weston warned. "Professional soldiers, not local troublemakers. This won't be like dealing with drunk cowboys or cattle rustlers." "Then it's good we brought help." Father Miguel gestured to the darkness beyond the porch, where more figures emerged from the shadows. Cowboys from neighboring ranches, shopkeepers from town, even old Mrs. Rodriguez clutching a shotgun that looked older than statehood. "How many?" Elizabeth asked, moving to stand beside Weston in the doorway. 37 so far," Father Miguel replied. "More coming as word spreads." Sheriff Coleman materialized from the group, his badge glinting in the lamplight. "Got word from the territorial capital, too. Governor's sending a company of cavalry, but they won't be here until day after tomorrow at the earliest." "We'll be dead or victorious by then," Weston said grimly. "Then we'd better plan for victorious." Coleman unfolded a hand-drawn map of the ranch and surrounding territory. "I've been thinking about defensive positions. That chapel of yours sits on high ground with good sight lines in all directions." Elizabeth stiffened beside Weston. "The chapel? You want to make our stand there?" "Makes the most sense tactically. Stone walls, elevated position, multiple escape routes if things go wrong." Coleman spread the map on the porch railing. "Plus, it's got symbolic value. They're coming after you because of what you were before Sister Mercy, hiding behind religious vows. Facing them where you found your true calling sends a message." "What message is that?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "That you're not running anymore. that you're exactly where you belong, with people who'll fight to keep you there. As the townspeople dispersed to gather supplies and prepare defensive positions, Weston and Elizabeth found themselves alone again in the ranch house. The map lay spread on the kitchen table, marked with positions and escape routes, a battle plan drawn in pencil and desperate hope. "Are you sure about this?" Elizabeth asked, studying the marks that represented their neighbors' lives. "All these people willing to die for someone they barely know." "They're not dying for you," Weston replied, checking the action on his Winchester. "They're fighting for the idea that decent people don't have to bow to corruption and violence. They're fighting for the right to choose their own destiny in a land that promises freedom but doesn't always deliver it." Elizabeth moved to the window, staring out at the darkness, where armed men were taking positions around the chapel on the hill. "I never asked for this. None of us did. But sometimes the fight finds you whether you want it or not." Weston joined her at the window, his arm coming around her waist. "The question is, what do you do when it arrives?" "We fight," Elizabeth said, leaning into his strength. "We fight for each other, for this community, for the chance to build something good from all this destruction. Even if it costs us everything?" Elizabeth turned in his arms, her hands coming up to frame his face. "Especially then, because what's the alternative? Spend the rest of our lives running? Let them win by default?" Weston kissed her then, deep and fierce, and full of all the emotions he couldn't put into words. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Tomorrow, after this is over, I'm going to marry you in that chapel. Father Miguel can perform the ceremony, and the whole town can witness it. What if there's no chapel left standing? Then we'll rebuild it, stone by stone, board by board, until it's more beautiful than it was before." Weston's hands tightened on her waist. "What if there's no town left? Then we'll rebuild that too, and if there's no territory left, we'll find new ground and start again." Elizabeth's smile held no fear, only determination. "But Weston, I don't think it's going to come to that." "Why not?" "Because I finally understand what Johnny's insurance money was really for. It wasn't a death benefit, it was a wedding present, a final gift from a man who knew he was going to die, to the wife he'd loved in his own broken way." Weston frowned. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth pulled away from him and walked to the mantel, where a small wooden box sat among the family photographs. She opened it and withdrew a bank draft, yellowed with age but still clearly readable. $50,000, made payable to Elizabeth Catherine Hart. She handed him the document with a smile that transformed her face. "Dated the day before Johnny died. He knew what was coming, and he wanted me to have a chance at happiness with someone better than him." Weston stared at the bank draft, understanding flooding through him. "You've had the money all along, hidden in my mother's jewelry box, along with a letter explaining everything. Johnny wasn't the monster I thought he was. He was a man trying to protect his wife, the only way he knew how." Elizabeth's voice grew stronger. "And tomorrow, when those killers come for money that was always meant to be mine, they're going to discover that they picked the wrong woman to hunt." Outside, the sound of men preparing for battle drifted through the night, air weapons being cleaned, positions being fortified, prayers being whispered to whatever gods watched over those foolish enough to fight for love in a world built on violence. But inside the ranch house, Weston Hart held his future wife and felt something he'd never experienced before. Absolute certainty that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together and emerge victorious. The insurance money had never been the real prize. The real prize was the woman in his arms, and the life they were going to build together in the ashes of everything that had tried to destroy them. The chapel cross had stood for 30 years above the altar, carved from oak by Spanish missionaries and blessed by 3 generations of priests. It had survived the fire that gutted half the building, emerging scarred but unbroken from flames that should have reduced it to ash. Now, as dawn painted the eastern sky the color of dried blood, Elizabeth Morrison held that same cross in her hands, not in prayer, but as a weapon. The attack came with the sunrise, just as Sheriff Coleman had predicted. 23 riders approached the chapel from multiple directions, their movements coordinated with military precision. These weren't opportunistic bounty hunters or corrupt officials. These were professional soldiers, hired guns who'd fought in territorial wars and private conflicts across the frontier. Weston lay prone behind the low stone wall that surrounded the chapel grounds, his Winchester trained on the lead riders. Around the perimeter, 37 townspeople waited in positions Coleman had carefully chosen during the pre-dawn hours. Shopkeepers and ranchers, mothers and grandfathers, united by something stronger than fear. "Easy," Weston called softly, his voice carrying to the defenders. "Let them get closer." The riders spread out as they approached, their leader a hard-faced man with sergeant's stripes still visible on his faded cavalry jacket, raising his hand to signal a halt just outside rifle range. "Elizabeth Morrison," the leader called, his voice echoing across the desert morning. "You're wanted for federal crimes. Come out peacefully, and nobody else needs to get hurt." From her position inside the chapel, Elizabeth felt her heart racing. She could see Weston's broad shoulders through the cracked window, steady as stone despite the overwhelming odds. She could see Father Miguel crouched behind an overturned pew, his hunting rifle looking incongruous in his weathered hands. "What's your answer?" Maria Martinez whispered beside her, little Jose miraculously still sleeping despite the tension. "The same as it's always been." Elizabeth gripped the wooden cross tighter, feeling the weight of carved oak in her palms. "I'm not running anymore." She moved to the chapel door, pushing it open with deliberate force. The hinges creaked in the morning stillness, a sound that seemed to carry across the desert like a bell tolling. "I'm Elizabeth Morrison," she called back, stepping onto the chapel's front steps. "And I'm not going anywhere." The leader nudged his horse forward a few steps. "Mrs. Morrison, you have property that belongs to our employers. Surrender it peacefully, and we can resolve this without bloodshed. Your employers murdered my husband to get that property." Elizabeth's voice carried across the desert air, strong and clear. "They framed me for crimes I didn't commit. They sent killers after me for money that was legally mine. The money belongs to the investors your husband robbed. The money belongs to me." Elizabeth held up the bank draft she'd hidden for 3 years. "Insurance money, legally obtained, legally inherited, money that your employers have no claim to." She could see the leader conferring with his men, their voices too low to carry. Whatever they decided, she knew it wouldn't end with peaceful surrender. These men had been paid to retrieve $50,000, and they weren't going home empty-handed. The first shot came from the ridge to the east, where one of the hired guns had worked his way into position during the negotiations. The bullet chipped stone near Elizabeth's feet, sending her diving back through the chapel door as Weston's Winchester barked in response. Then the morning exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions at once as the hired guns launched their coordinated assault. Bullets splintered wood and scattered stone dust as the chapel's defenders returned fire with everything they had. Weston's first shot dropped the leader's horse, sending the man scrambling for cover behind the dying animal. His second shot took out a flanking rider who'd tried to circle toward the chapel's blind side. "They're trying to surround us," Coleman shouted from his position near the altar. "Maria, take the baby to the back room." Elizabeth watched Maria disappear into the chapel's rear quarters, then turned her attention to the battle raging outside. Through the windows, she could see muzzle flashes and powder smoke as 37 ordinary people fought trained killers with the desperation of those defending their homes. Old Mrs. Rodriguez had taken position behind a stone outcropping, her ancient shotgun booming like thunder as she sent buckshot into the ranks of attackers. 2 of the Henderson brothers worked their way along the chapel's north wall, their hunting rifles picking off riders with the patience of men who'd spent years tracking deer through mountain forests. But the attackers were professionals, and they were adapting quickly to the terrain. Small groups began flanking the chapel's defenses, using the rocky ground for cover as they worked their way closer to the building. "Elizabeth," Weston's voice carried through the gunfire. "They're trying to get to the back door." She moved through the chapel, the wooden cross still clutched in her hands, and positioned herself where she could see the rear entrance. Sure enough, 3 men were working their way up the hill's back slope, using scrub brush and boulders for concealment. The first man through the door never saw her coming. Elizabeth brought the heavy oak cross down on his skull with all the force she could muster, dropping him unconscious to the stone floor. The second man raised his pistol toward her, but Father Miguel's rifle spoke from the shadows, sending the attacker spinning into the wall. The third man hesitated, giving Elizabeth the opening she needed. She swung the cross like a club, catching him across the forearm and sending his weapon flying. Before he could recover, she drove the pointed base of the cross into his solar plexus, doubling him over and leaving him gasping on the floor. "Behind you!" Father Miguel called. Elizabeth spun to find another attacker in the chapel doorway, his gun trained on her heart. Time seemed to slow as she saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw death approaching with mathematical certainty. Then Weston Hart filled the doorway like an avenging angel, his Colt .25 bucking in his hand. The attacker's shot went wild, chipping stone from the altar as the man crumpled to the ground. "You all right?" Weston demanded, moving to her side. "I'm fine." Elizabeth looked down at the wooden cross in her hands, now stained with blood from the men she'd fought. "Better than fine. Good, because we've got more coming." Through the chapel windows, Elizabeth could see the remaining attackers regrouping for another assault. They'd lost nearly half their number, but the survivors were the most dangerous, the ones smart enough and skilled enough to survive the initial exchange of gunfire. "How many left?" she asked. "Maybe 12, 13, but they're the best of the bunch." Weston reloaded his revolver with practiced efficiency. "They'll try to rush us next, overwhelm our positions with pure aggression. Can we hold them?" Weston looked at her across the blood-spattered chapel, seeing not the frightened nun who'd arrived 3 months ago, but the strong woman who'd chosen to stand and fight for the life they'd built together. "With you fighting beside me, I like our chances." The second wave came hard and fast, professional killers abandoning caution for overwhelming violence. They rushed the chapel from 3 sides simultaneously, hoping to breach the defenses through sheer audacity. Elizabeth found herself fighting hand to hand as attackers poured through the windows and doors. The wooden cross became her weapon and her shield, blocking knife thrusts and crushing bones with equal efficiency. Beside her, Weston moved like a force of nature, his gun and fists dealing death to anyone who threatened the woman he loved. Father Miguel fought with the desperate courage of a man protecting his church, while outside the chapel walls, the people of Espiranza held their ground against impossible odds. When the smoke finally cleared and the last shots echoed across the desert, 13 bodies lay scattered around the chapel grounds. The hired army sent to capture Elizabeth Morrison had been broken by ordinary people fighting for something more valuable than money. But as Elizabeth stood among the wounded and the dead, the wooden cross still clutched in her bloody hands, she realized the real battle was just beginning. Mercy's wedding ring, the thin gold band Johnny Morrison had placed on her finger in a St. Louis church what felt like a lifetime ago, had never left her hand until this moment. Even during her years as Sister Mercy, she'd worn it beneath her gloves, a reminder of vows made and broken, of love turned to betrayal and pain. Now, as she stood in the blood-spattered chapel with Weston Hart beside her and the bodies of their enemies scattered around them, she finally understood what that ring had always represented, not the marriage she'd lost, but the woman she'd been afraid to become. With steady fingers, she slipped the gold band from her finger and set it on the altar beside the wooden cross she'd wielded as a weapon. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. She was laying down the last remnant of Elizabeth Morrison's tragic past to become someone new, someone stronger, someone worthy of the love that had saved her. Elizabeth. Weston's voice was gentle despite the violence they'd just survived. Blood streaked his face from a grazing bullet, and his shirt was torn from the hand-to-hand fighting, but his eyes held only tenderness as he looked at her. "It's over." "No," she said quietly, surprising everyone in the chapel. "Not yet." She moved to where the leader of the attackers lay dying against the chapel wall, his cavalry jacket dark with blood, but his eyes still alert with hatred. He'd taken a bullet in the chest during the final assault, but had somehow survived when most of his men had not. "You," she said, kneeling beside him, "you came here for money that was never yours to claim. But this was never really about money, was it?" The dying man's laugh turned into a cough that brought up blood. "Smart, little nun, smarter than your husband was. Who sent you? Who really wants me dead?" "Men who run this territory from the shadows. Men who can't afford to let Johnny Morrison's wife keep breathing." Elizabeth felt the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "Because I know too much. Not about stolen money, but about the corruption Johnny uncovered. About the illegal land deals and fraudulent mining claims. Johnny Morrison was a small-time outlaw who got too curious about big-time thieves. The man's breathing grew more labored, started asking questions about territorial officials who got rich too fast. And they killed him for it. They killed him to protect themselves. Just like they'll keep sending men until you're dead too." Weston knelt beside Elizabeth, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "Then we make sure they can't send anyone else." The dying man's eyes focused on Weston with something like respect. "You think you can fight the territorial government? You think your little town can stand against men with real power?" "I think," Elizabeth said quietly, "that it's time the territory learned the truth about its leaders." She stood and walked to where her small bundle of possessions lay beside the altar. From within, she withdrew a leather portfolio she'd kept hidden for 3 years. Documents Johnny had given her just days before his death. Papers he'd told her to keep safe but never explained. Now, as she opened the portfolio for the first time, she understood why he'd been so insistent about their importance. Land deeds signed by territorial officials for property that belonged to Indian tribes. Mining claims filed under false names by the same men who wrote territorial policy. Bank records showing payments to government officials from railroad companies that had received exclusive contracts without competitive bidding. "Johnny wasn't just an outlaw," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the chapel. "He was gathering evidence of corruption that went all the way to the territorial capital. This is what they've really been after all these years. Not insurance money, but proof of their crimes." Father Miguel moved closer, examining the documents over her shoulder. "This evidence, it could bring down half the territorial government." "Which is exactly what we're going to do." Elizabeth looked around the chapel at the people who'd risked their lives to protect her shopkeepers and ranchers. Mothers and grandfathers who'd stood against professional killers for the sake of justice. "We're going to send copies of these documents to every newspaper from Santa Fe to Denver. We're going to make sure the whole territory knows what kind of men have been running things." Sheriff Coleman, nursing a wounded arm but still alert, spoke up from his position near the door. "That'll make us targets for every corrupt official in the territory." "We're already targets," Weston replied grimly. "At least this way, we're fighting back." The dying cavalry leader made one last effort to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't know what you're starting, the kind of war you're bringing down on this place." "We know exactly what we're starting," Elizabeth said. "We're starting the end of your employer's reign of terror." She turned to face the people gathered in the chapel, her people now, the community that had chosen to stand with her when the whole world seemed arrayed against them. "I'm done hiding," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally found her true calling. "I'm done running from fights that need fighting. I'm done letting corrupt men destroy innocent lives for profit." She moved to stand beside Weston, taking his hand in hers. "I'm Elizabeth Morrison Hart, and I choose to make my stand here, with this man, among these people. in this place we've all helped to defend. Elizabeth Morrison Hart? Father Miguel asked with a knowing smile. Well, I will be as soon as you can perform the ceremony. She looked at Weston, seeing the love and pride in his eyes. That is, if you'll still have a wife who comes with a portfolio full of evidence against territorial corruption and a target on her back the size of New Mexico. Weston's answer was to kiss her, deep and fierce and full of promises, right there in the blood-spattered chapel, surrounded by the aftermath of battle. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he kept his forehead pressed against hers. I'll take you any way I can get you, darling, with or without federal warrants, church discipline, or half the territorial government trying to kill us. Then let's get married, Elizabeth said, surprising everyone, including herself. Right now, right here, while the smoke is still clearing and the evidence is still warm. Let's start our life together the way we mean to go on, fighting for what's right and standing together against whatever comes. Father Miguel looked around the chapel, taking in the broken windows, the blood-stained floor, the wooden cross that had become a weapon and then been returned to its sacred purpose. I can't think of a more appropriate place for a wedding, he said with gentle humor. God's house has seen enough violence today. It's time for it to witness love. As the surviving townspeople gathered around them, some wounded but all victorious, Elizabeth Morrison removed her mother's silver locket and handed it to Maria Martinez. For your son, she said quietly, so he'll remember the day his community proved that ordinary people can defeat evil when they stand together. Then she turned back to Weston, ready to take the vows that would bind her to him for whatever storms lay ahead. Outside, the sun was climbing toward its zenith, burning away the last of the morning shadows that had hidden their enemies. The battle was over. The war for the soul of the territory was just beginning. But Elizabeth Morrison Hart, no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer afraid, was ready for whatever came next. The new church bell that rang out across the Espiranza Valley 6 months later carried a sound unlike any heard in the territory before, clear and strong and full of hope that seemed to rise from the desert earth itself and climb toward the endless sky. Cast in Denver from bronze, donated by supporters across 3 territories, it bore a simple inscription, "In memory of those who stand against corruption, Chapel of San Rafael, 1883. Elizabeth Hart stood in the doorway of the rebuilt chapel, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, where new life grew beneath the blue cotton dress that had replaced her nun's habit forever. The morning sun painted the adobe walls gold, and wildflowers bloomed in the church garden, where Maria Martinez had planted them in memory of the battle that had changed everything. Beautiful sound, Weston said, coming up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist. His touch was gentle, protective, infinitely loving the same hands that had wielded deadly weapons, now cradling the promise of their future. Beautiful, everything. Elizabeth leaned back against his chest, watching as the people of Espiranza went about their morning business in the town below. Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this? Which part? The part where we brought down half the territorial government, or the part where the woman I love is carrying my child? Elizabeth laughed, the sound mixing with the bell's melody. Both, I suppose. The political aftermath had been swift and decisive once Johnny Morrison's evidence reached the right newspapers. 3 territorial officials had been arrested for corruption, 2 mining companies had lost their fraudulent claims, and the railroad contracts were being rebid under federal oversight. The territorial governor himself had resigned in disgrace, paving the way for an administration that actually served the people rather than exploiting them. Marshal Garrett stopped by yesterday while you were in town, Elizabeth said. The final arrest warrants were served in Santa Fe. The last of the men who ordered those attacks on us are in federal custody. Good. Weston's arms tightened around her. Though, I have to say, I'm going to miss having something to fight against. Peaceful domesticity might take some getting used to. Oh, I wouldn't worry about that. Elizabeth turned in his arms, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Wait until the baby arrives. You'll have plenty of battles ahead, middle-of-the-night feedings, diaper changes, trying to teach a Hart child not to bite the other children during Sunday services." Speaking of Sunday services, Weston nodded toward the chapel, where Father Miguel was arranging flowers on the altar. "Are you ready for this?" Today marked the official dedication of the rebuilt chapel, and Elizabeth had been asked to give a blessing as the woman whose stand had made the victory possible. It would be the first time she'd stood before a congregation since removing her nun's habit, the first time she'd spoken as Elizabeth Hart rather than Sister Mercy. "More ready than I've ever been for anything." She took Weston's hand and led him into the chapel, where sunlight streamed through new stained glass windows donated by grateful communities across the territory. The chapel was packed to overflowing with people who'd traveled from hundreds of miles away to witness the dedication. Ranchers and shopkeepers, territorial officials and federal marshals, reporters from newspapers in Denver and Santa Fe, all gathered to celebrate the triumph of ordinary people over systematic corruption. Maria Martinez sat in the front pew with little Jose, now a toddler who gurgled happily at the sight of Elizabeth. Sheriff Coleman occupied his usual spot near the back, his deputy's badge gleaming on his vest. He'd been promoted after his role in exposing the corruption had come to light. Even some of the church officials from Santa Fe were present, having made their peace with Elizabeth's departure from religious life. Bishop Calderon himself had written a letter acknowledging that sometimes God's calling led in unexpected directions, and that service to humanity took many forms. As Elizabeth rose to address the congregation, she felt the weight of history settling around her shoulders. Not the crushing weight of guilt and fear that had burdened her for so long, but the lighter, stronger weight of purpose and belonging. "6 months ago," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chapel, "this building was a broken place, sheltering broken people. I came here as Sister Mercy Langford, running from a past I couldn't face and hiding behind vows I'd taken for all the wrong reasons." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the faces before her, faces that had become dear to her, people who'd risked everything to stand with her when the world seemed arrayed against them. "But this community taught me something I'd forgotten, that redemption isn't about running from who you were, but about choosing who you want to become. That love isn't something you have to earn through suffering, but something freely given by people who see your worth even when you can't see it yourself." Weston smiled at her from the front pew, his hand resting on his father's pocket watch, which had started working again the day they were married, as if their love had somehow restored its broken mechanism. "This chapel has been rebuilt with materials donated by people we've never met, by communities who heard our story and wanted to be part of something good. These walls represent more than architecture. They represent the possibility of starting over, of building something beautiful from the wreckage of what came before." Elizabeth's hand moved to rest on her belly, feeling the flutter of movement from the child who would grow up in this place of hope and renewal. "My husband and I will raise our children here, in this community that showed us what it means to stand together against darkness. And someday, when they're old enough to understand, we'll tell them about the day their town proved that corruption and violence can't stand against ordinary people who refuse to be afraid." She looked directly at Maria Martinez, at Father Miguel, at Sheriff Coleman, at all the faces that had become her family. "Thank you for giving me a home. Thank you for giving me a purpose. Thank you for showing me that sometimes the greatest act of faith isn't kneeling in prayer, but standing up and fighting for what's right." As the congregation rose to their feet in applause, the new bell began to ring again, its bronze voice carrying across the valley with news of celebration and renewal. Elizabeth felt Weston's hand find hers, felt the baby flutter beneath her heart, felt the warm embrace of a community that had chosen love over fear and justice over profit. Through the chapel's new windows, she could see the vast expanse of New Mexico territory stretching toward the mountains, land that was cleaner now, governed by better men, protected by laws that served the people rather than exploiting them. It wasn't perfect, would never be perfect, but it was better than it had been. And in this place where she'd found love and purpose and the courage to stop running, Elizabeth Morrison Hart finally understood what redemption really meant. It wasn't about erasing the past or hiding from it. It was about using everything you'd learned, every scar you carried, every lesson bought with pain, to build something better for those who came after. The bell continued ringing as the congregation filed out of the chapel, its bronze voice mixing with laughter and conversation and the sound of children playing in the desert sunshine. Elizabeth remained behind for a moment, alone with Weston, in the place where their love had been forged in fire and sanctified by community. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, pulling her close. Elizabeth looked around the chapel one last time at the altar, where she'd knelt as Sister Mercy and stood as Elizabeth Hart, at the windows that had been shattered by gunfire and replaced with beauty, at the cross that had been both weapon and symbol of faith. "Only one," she said, smiling up at the man who'd loved her enough to fight the world for her. "I regret that it took me so long to realize I was exactly where I belonged." Outside, the bell rang on, its voice carrying news of hope and renewal across a land that was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, what it meant to be free. And in the chapel of San Rafael, surrounded by the community that had saved her and the man who'd claimed her heart, Elizabeth Hart finally found the peace that had eluded her for so long. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly who she was meant to be. And that, she thought, as Weston's arms tightened around her and their child fluttered beneath her heart, was the greatest victory of all.